Hello. So once more, I am returning to the Facebreaker build on Path of Exile. So I've gone ahead and leveled it up at this point to level 80. And this is basically going to be a retrospect on how the build went. So I'm basically have a little bit of B-roll going in the background. So this first bit of B-roll is basically me doing the Eternal Labyrinth the fourth time. Actually, for the second time. So it's fourth lab for the second time. And you can see that this build at this point is getting fairly workable. It sort of, in many ways, actually sort of casually ends up doing this lab. So it's a little over-leveled at this point, but this is also the second time it's done this lab. So I think the second lab is level 75. And of course the build was actually over-leveled when doing it the first time. I think it was 78 when I did it the first time. But you're going to see that it casually goes through most of this. And really the only times it gets anywhere close to dying are situations where either I'm being a little too casual around the traps and take a lot of damage because I'm just hanging out in the traps. Because that's something this build actually does reasonably well, is it can basically hang out in the traps. Or because I'm facing a Zaro, right? So Zaro is dangerous enough that I can 3-hit this build at this point. Though that on this build is again that's a lot more tolerable, right? You can tolerate this build and tolerate getting hit once or twice, especially because of that very high block, right? We've basically got the block cap at this point. Well, the block cap that this character can get to without raising its max block. And because of that, it very unlikely to actually get hit during the Azara fight. Which means if you get into a scenario where you're worried about getting hit multiple times in a row, that's a lot less of a problem. Because the build sort of takes that in stride and you can recover from it really quickly. So some things about the build, right, as you can see I've gone ahead and I've gone 2 war cries for damage. One of them's the slam specific war cry, which is the one that's got 2 charges and then it's got a different war cry as well. Just to increase the damage a little bit more. The build still doesn't have a lot of damage. It's got decent damage, but it doesn't have a lot of damage. So you're going to see that in scenarios where you're sort of playing content that isn't like endgame specific, the build handles that really well. But it doesn't necessarily handle like if you've perked out Essence to the max, the build isn't handling that very well. So endgame Atlas or endgame Essence Atlas, it's not handling very well. So in the later bit of the B-roll, you'll probably see me actually intentionally skip over an Essence monster that I've got something like 6 or 7 mods on, Essence mods, because I look at it and go like, yeah, the build probably would have handled 1, 2, 3, 6 on a tier 16 map. It isn't going to do. And it's only level 80, and it otherwise, with 1 death, can do a tier 16 map, right? So, be careful at this point, right? It is really reasonably tanky. Maybe not tanky enough for what people might want for like a hardcore build, but for just doing it on basically basically doing it on trade regular. It works really well. And pretty much everything on this build, why this build isn't built solar cell found, you probably could build the solar cell found. I'm very adverse to using trade, so everything on this build is stuff that I have looted between this character and the SRS build. It is an endurance charge stacker, so it handles physical damage really well. One of the things I recently added is I added a couple of annoyance in on the amulet, which makes it so that my guard skill, whenever I activate, removes corrupting blood and bleed. So here you actually see me making a bit of a mistake. I didn't realize most of the time when I get gold gates, there's gold gates, right? So you get a choice. So I walked there, I saw the first gold gate, and went, two choices, left or right. But I'm missing the key. But this is not one of those. This is a scenario where there's a gold gate on the right, and you've got to go left down this side alternate path to get the key to come back to go through the gate. So I'm actually going to skip forward a little bit because we're doing a bunch of backtracking, looking for a key that isn't going to be anywhere. So basically I end up full clearing the first 2 zones looking for a key that isn't there. But again, you can see the build is basically sort of casually doing this content. In a way, if you're farming lab for random loot, this is probably what you want to do. You probably want to clear anything anyway. But if you were just in here trying to get through to Zaro, this would be a lot of backtracking that you wouldn't need to do just to get to the reward at the end. So here I've gone down the side that I missed the first time, realized, oh, that door is not actually closed. I can go that way. And this is one of the scenarios you can see. I'm sort of just, I get a little close to dead, just because I'm just a little too casual in the traps, because I take reduced physical damage from like everything. And the build sort of tolerates that, right? It wasn't like a complete panic issue. I just get closer than I probably would have wanted to tolerate on the SRS build, which doesn't have as much regen. But yeah, so this build very casually does content that's like mid-core, right? So it does this well. After these Zara fights and showing you the gear, I'm going to show you it doing some delve stuff. So it does delve reasonably well. I really enjoy running this build on delve, which is something I wouldn't like to do on the SRS, right? The SRS build is just too squishy, and delve is one of those sorts of content where if the content resets whenever you die, that doesn't work on the SRS build, but this build is tanky enough that, okay, this is softcore, I'm playing it way too casually to not die, so I still die on things like 12. But I can make progress in delve on this build because this build is simply tanky enough that even playing a bit casual, it does that content, right? It doesn't have an immediate. I think I'm trying to flame dash here to a location, I just don't quite have the reach. But we come in here, we're gonna trove. Well, if I'd held on L to ult, I probably would have found maybe a card or two more. I think I had the I think my loot filter is a little over-intensive on cards at the moment. Granted, that would mean it basically left maybe a low-value card or two behind, which is probably fine if you're more trade-focused than I am. I probably didn't leave anything important behind, but I think there's probably a divination card or two I left behind there. I think one of the buffs that I have on right now is making my character a little bit bigger, which actually is I think at some points when I'm fighting Azaro a little cool, because I feel like it was almost as big as Azaro in some of the upcoming fights. But yeah, this is a build. It's working a lot better than it was back in Act 4 and 5, because I've finally gotten around to sorting out a lot of the damage. In this case, this build's basically getting damage from 4 different items. It's getting damage from the belt, which maybe in the long run isn't the best belt. I don't know a better way to get damage on the belt than this item, but it's a unique item. It's a fairly common unique item, so it's not something that would be too difficult to farm. Because it's an item that I farmed even before I had built this character, right? So I had one in the bank. And had I not been focused earlier on building resist in the build, it probably would have gone on the build earlier. It actually goes on the build as late as it does, which was actually post Kitava, because the other build I was using was just so much better at resists. So it's one of those I didn't get the resists sort of tweaked right to be able to swap to a lot more damage. In the end, I end up having more resist than I need, and thus I can swap away from such a dense belt. But this is got a belt. It's got what is it? I think it's the Contempt mod. It's got the Contempt mod on both rings and the necklace, which is one of the reasons why you'll see on when we do get to the map why I have Essence on that Atlas. In hindsight, Essence is probably not really a good thing for this build to run, but it's something you need for your equipment, right? So, in hindsight, I probably should have spent more time farming Contempt Essences on the SRS build rather than trying to do it on this build. Because this build just doesn't run full Essence Atlases very well. Because it handles 1 or 2, maybe even 3 Essence monsters reasonably well. But when you get into scenarios when you're trying to fight 6 or 7 Essence monsters that you can get with full game, like endgame Atlases, this build doesn't quite have the damage to comfortably do those things. And then if the Essence monsters roll like a regen mod or something like that, or worse, fizz resistance, if anything, those mods can get the monster to basically invulnerability, and then that's just not a fun fight. Not that the build has anything problem with it from a tankiness standpoint. So this build happily fights those. It's just tedious with that many mons on it. Whereas the Popcorn SRS build I've run the other one I've run in this league has far more damage, and in those scenarios it's having to spend most of the fight trying not to die. Whereas this one could just sit there and take blows to the face, but that damage allows it to face brand those things out. But yeah, this character, really fun to do Delve with. I'm going to show you some Delve with it. And I'm going to show you how it handles Azara. Here we're kind of doing a puzzle in a labyrinth. If you're in the labyrinth purely for your masteries, you probably would skip this content. Because you're going to try to get through it as quickly as possible to get your masteries. This is a build at this point that has actually already done its masteries. So when we actually get to the end, I'm not even going to look at the altar right away. I'm just going to show you all the items on the build, and show you how I've done the masteries on the master tree. There's probably better ways to do the passives on the mastery tree, but this is how I've done it. When we get there. Skip ahead a little bit. So we can get to Azaro. So here's an Azaro fight coming up. And you can see, because of the improvements in the damage in here, the normal rares you find in maps, the normal rares you find in maps, the normal rares you find in labyrinths and stuff like that, the build is officially at the damage standpoint where, with a few exceptions sometimes, specifically I don't have any good fizz resist pen on this build, so if you get like a rapid shield regener, a rapid shield regener, or a fizz resistant monster, or both, especially both, you can get into scenarios where it's just not fun to fight those monsters, but you're no way are you prevented from fighting those things, right? This build can generally fight them. And if you haven't stacked Essence mods, I haven't run into a map boss that isn't beatable. I'm going to show you, probably the last clip I'm going to show you is going through a tier 16 map. And it will do the map, and I think I just pulled a bad random boss on the tier 16 map. So the second of the 2 bosses, because I think it's a lighthouse map, just takes forever to kill. But once I'd worked out what the big blow, or the big high damage attack for that monster was, I was never really at threat as long as I was paying attention to actually die during that fight, which is a nice thing. And you can see this build is tanky enough, it can take a blow from Azaro, and at no point is it like panic, I need to heal right now. And maybe why that's a bit of a slow Azaro fight, right? The SRS build probably would have done that fight faster. The SRS build still hasn't done the last fight, right? I haven't actually completed my masteries on the SRS build because the SRS build's too squishy. Stuff gets in the way, and I take 2 hits from Azaro, and that build dies. This build doesn't. This build very happily can take 2 hits. Well, I've noticed it taking 2 hits before and being fine. In actual fact, that probably means that build took
potentially up to 6, because it's only got 23% block, or it's only got 66% block, right? So mean number of hits to take to actually get hit twice would be something like 6, right? So the build is tanky enough that when you combo and block, that there's a lot less to worry about as far as actually dying is concerned, right? So the build works pretty well. One thing you can see that I've snuck into the build that I probably should have been using there is I have Frost Bomb as a life regen reduction. That's because if you get a particularly healthy enemy, a particularly healthy rare, the build already has 50% life regen on enemies that are nearby it. So that combined with Frost Orb means I can actually take regen to 0. So in some more tedious fights, if I'm worried about an enemy regenerating, I can literally just turn their regen off, which is really nice. Though that makes it a little tedier. Maybe one thing that could be changed in the build is, I know there's a mastery that makes it so anything you hit has minus 50% regen, and that would stack with the already existing 50% regen, so everything that I'm hitting isn't regenning, which would be a little less tedious than trying to do Frost Bomb for everything. And yeah, and as you can see, Ground Slam works. Ground Slam's got big AoE. Maybe doesn't have quite the single target damage that you might want from a melee build, specifically for fighting bosses, right? If you're just one boss, there's definitely scenarios where you aren't quite doing as much damage as you'd like to that one boss. But this build's really good at killing any of the adds that pop in. And Val Ground Slam has some very fun moments when you're doing something like Delve, and you can just go, okay, I do exert, Val Ground Slam, and delete all the enemies in the room. Just all the enemies die. That's something that this build does really nice. And then in the scenarios where it doesn't kill them for whatever reason, you very frequently get exert, Val Grand Slam, and the guys that don't die frequently get stunned with the way it's built up for the moment. And this build, because it hasn't been dying, hasn't actually maxed out most of its gems now, right? So there's still a couple more levels on the Ground Slam, a couple more levels on the Fizz damage, and so on and so forth, right? So all the gems actually have still more potential to get even more useful from a damage standpoint. And you can see right there, basically exert, and you can just press a button to delete everything in the room, all the minor stuff in the room. And you can see here, I press Alt and recognize that two of the divination cards got left on the floor. So I'm not 100% sure. I probably lost a couple the same way on the first one, because well, at this point I have the inventory to handle divination cards, but I think my loot filter is probably turned up a bit too strict for that. Here comes the second Azara fight, if memory serves.
When the time comes to strike, an emperor strikes without hesitation. To entertain doubt is to slowness lends
And
strength.
I don't think there's going to be anything really special about the second one. The other one's basically sort of the first fight, round 2. So I think this is the fight I noticed where my character is about the same size as Azara. And then there's one time right where you saw it just right there where maybe let Azaro hit me a few too many times in a row. But when you're dodge built or not block built like this, you can get in situations where you suddenly don't realize, oh wait, I must have failed like two block rows in a row, and get like double hit or something like that, and take a lot of damage that you weren't expecting. But as you can see, I very rapidly recovered from it. I've got Steel Skin, I've got 2 health pods, I've got a War Cry that heals me based on the enemies in the proximity. So there's a lot of healing in here. There's a lot of reasonably passive healing in here, right? The way I got the life regen on the enemies is actually to dip into one of the nodes that is actually local passive healing as well. So I've got more regen than normal. Yeah. And again, you can see there's not a lot of work going on with the flasks. That's actually a place where there's probably space for improvement. The flasks are pretty simple. The 2 health flasks look different, but they're basically the same. The difference on one is one has a magic enhancement that basically makes it act like 2. At this point, I'm not even running a magic Quicksilver. It's just a normal Quicksilver. The Granite Flask, I think, technically has curse reduction, so I'm taking less curses, a little bit less curse effect when it's up. But I'm not necessarily the best at reliably remembering to use it, so sometimes it's just like, yeah, I could get more curse reduction if I remembered what I was doing, but I'm not necessarily always remembering what I'm doing. And the mana one I have changed that it doesn't stop going if I hit max mana. Because a lot of the endgame mana flasks are functionally bigger than my character's mana pool. So you get into this area where it's like, okay, I need mana to do DPS. Because the build is not mana positive. It is mana negative when it's really trying to beat on a boss's face. From sort of just wandering around the map, it's really mana sustain reasonable for clearing out whites and stuff like that. But if you're just sitting there pounding on a boss, as I'll do in the red map near the end of this stream/video, the build isn't mana stable in that scenario, and it needs the mana pot. So just having one that doesn't turn off when you hit full because you're not necessarily burning faster than the flask is generating is really useful. And that's the flasks, right? The flasks are pretty boring. I'm not even going to show you the flasks. That's as much flask as you're going to get out of me. Because if anything, I know the flasks need to be improved if I were to take this build into any sort of endgame bosses. But for just sort of casually doing mapping, it doesn't need that. The flasks work as they are. The flasks don't need to be anything special. Taking a moment to breathe and think. And in many ways the gear isn't that special. The gear is, other than the 4 items that are giving me flat melee fizz. Most of the items on the Facebreaker are just the stuff I need to get my resists sorted. And in the case of the tower shield is just like a 750 armor tower shield, right? It's a nice tower shield, and that's basically it. It's nothing. It's not a special tower shield. I think it's one of the rare pulls that I've actually pulled from. Oh, now I'm forgetting the name, or ROG. One of the rare pulls from ROG that I pulled. I'm like, yep, this looks good. It's not necessarily anything super special. It's just a ROG pull. It's special enough I haven't found a replacement for it. It's probably the best way to describe that shield. Which is not a glowing diamond, but it's also a description of what you can get away with, right? You don't necessarily need super great special stuff to make the build work. I know one of the comments was, oh, there's a shield you can get that does base fizz damage as well. I don't think this build actually has enough dex to use that shield, which is why this build isn't using that shield. Because the build doesn't have enough dex. That can be fixed if you think you need that damage. And that's not non-zero damage, that's actually a decent amount of damage. You probably could swing the dex to make that work. Just the build at the moment isn't swinging the dex. And for a while, actually, what was stopping me from improving my damage was trying to figure out how to get the stats to work on the build. Because to improve one of the rings from basically being a double iron ring, as far as damage is concerned, to what it is now, trying to figure out how to get one more int in the rest of the build so I could swap rings, because I needed the one int on, well, the ring had 25 int, but I needed one other int on the build, or on the ring, to change the ring. Because that's how tight the stats are for the build at the moment. And there's ways to fix that, right? So the int requirement here that I need for the build to work is to wear the body armor I'm wearing right now, which is the 5 link. You could, depending on what happens, just find a 5 link that doesn't have an int requirement. My 5 link that has the int requirement is a armor ES hybrid. You probably can just find a different one that, if you can find a pure strength one, then that problem goes away. That's not a problem anymore. But this build, also because it's very tanky, did very little dying. So from when I left you off in the last Path of Exile Facebreaker build video to this one, basically every play session I was leveling up at least a level. So the build didn't actually spend very much time gameplay-wise between when you last saw it and the beginning of this video. And as a side effect, I didn't actually loot that many items to change much, right? So most of it was just burning my Contempt supply down. Contempt is the type of essence that you use to get the flat damage on rings and amulets. And yeah, that was a nice source of damage. And the build, I think the build near the end, not on POB, but in Path of Exile is estimating something like 8,000, 9,000 damage. Which for a lot of content works. It's maybe not enough for high tier Alkin go, right? So this build can basically casually do basically any white content. But if you're alking your maps, you might have the occasional mod set that's going to be a little bit of a problem with it. Though, again, I think from a damage standpoint, it's not going to be a problem from incoming, it's going to be a problem outgoing, right? The build's probably tanky enough that you're not worried about being in a scenario where you are taking too much damage. You're going to be worried in the scenario where you're not able to deal with it, or deal it out. So this is the last Azara fight in this lab. I know this isn't the highest level lab, but this is the highest level lab that isn't done purely for loot. Right, so this is probably something you will want to do if to get your masteries anyway. And a bit of a weird thing that I sort of realized part of the way through this bit of the fight is I'm far more threatened from the traps in this room than I am threatened by Azara. Because of the high block on this build, Azaro mostly, even if he scores a hit on me, is missing. Because it gets blocked, basically. In the way that block works, sort of like dodge. But I don't get that path, or I don't get that effect on the traps. The traps actually still hit, and I think the traps do a percentile of max health as damage, so the traps actually hit pretty hard and hurt a lot. So I'm spending more time trying to avoid the traps than I'm actually trying to avoid Azaro, because I'm not too worried about Azaro at this point. It's the third time fighting Azaro in this dungeon run, or in this lab run, and this is my second time doing the lab. So you wouldn't see this if this fight didn't go well. This fight went reasonably well. Sadly, maybe not as cinematic as the very first one that I didn't record. That one was, I think, in the fire arena. So whenever you teleport me out, you basically chuck me out into the fire. And again, the build is tanky enough that being on fire isn't really a problem for it. So it was kind of just sort of like I just chucked out of the arena by Azaro's teleport, and like, I'm gonna run back up to Azaro. And it's not a problem. The build is tanky enough. It fights Azaro. It's maybe not as fast as you would want it to be, right? If you wanted to come here to farm Azaro, it's probably not farming it quickly enough for many people's tastes. You probably want to be able to farm it better. And you can see there, I maybe didn't realize that was going to kill him at the time, but I basically just finished him off with the Valground Slam. And I'm looking at the tower shield, it's like, maybe if I got a good roll in that tower shield, it'd be better than what I have. It won't be. So open up the passive tree, basically showing you all the passives I've taken. So here's the masteries I took. You'd already seen the first 6 of them, so you're just seeing that I added 2 more since then. So basically, unyielding to maximize the damage out from all our endurance charges, unrelenting, which gives us more fizz and elemental resist, and then unstoppable, because no one likes being stunned, and we like to maintain our base movement speed. And basically, I'm slowly highlighting all the options where there's choices I could have made, just so you can see which choice I made. Otherwise, everything else you can sort of just see. And at any point, if you wanted to, because this will both be a VOD and a YouTube vid, right? So if you're on the YouTube and you wanted to sort of check anything, remember you can pause the video. That's why I'm not sort of spending a long time hovering over everything. You can see here, it's got all the resists. It's way overcapped on fire. In an ideal world, I'd find a way to trade more of that fire for chaos resist. It's a little low on chaos resist, which actually, until I got the guard skill effect that removes corrupting blood, man, one of the biggest things this build had problems with was actually corrupting blood. Because once you got it on you, if you got a lethal amount of corrupting blood on it, you'd be a bit annoying when you're just watching your HP drain away and there's nothing you can do about it. Let's see if I can... I probably went through the items a bit quickly. But you can sort of see Iron Ring. A lot of the rings are basically sort of similar to this, right? Where I've used Kitava to roll some flat fizz damage attacks. And then if I've had empty space, I've crafted increased damage on top of it. And the hat's a hat. The hat's actually something that's open to being replaced if I can get it replaced. And I've gone to grab. As I said, I used an ointment to add a modifier on here that removes bleeding and corrupted blood when I use guard skill. Adamant's the particular one in this case. You could definitely use a different one here. This build, I think, if I level up 4 times, would have enough passive points to take Adamant without having to use the anointment. So you can use the anointment on something else, and without modifying the build very much. And there were a couple other ones I was looking at when I was thinking about doing the anointment. But in the end, I ended up going with Adamant just because I had the anointment for it, because I don't actually do a lot of blight content, so the oils that I have are a bit more restricted in what I can run as far as anointments go. And as you can see, a lot of the equipment is just, what does it take to keep me resist capped, while as much of my equipment can be focused on damage as possible, right? So the 2 rings, the amulet, and the belt here have fizz damage attacks. Because that's what I need to get the damage to where I needed it to be. Yeah, so with that, I'll move on to the delve content. And you're going to see this thing sort of casually delves, right? I didn't do any delving while leveling, but once I got into maps, delve was a really fun way to level. And this is delving once I've reached 80, right? So not much to say other than it. Unless you get a multiple rares of particularly bad resistant types, the build generally handles fairly well. And here, I'm actually just full misplaying. One of the reasons this fight looks like it's going as badly as it is because I actually walked my hand like 1 letter to the left, so I'm trying to hit 5 and I'm hitting 4, and trying to do R and I'm hitting E, and that's why the fight's going badly, right? But at the same time, the build is so tanky that didn't break the build. The build still somehow worked even when hitting the wrong buttons half the time. And then I finally get the fingers back in the right place, and the build starts handling it all. And you can see here that really the build, as long as I'm hitting roughly the right buttons in the right order, isn't having a problem with generic content. Right? It's really fun, especially in these sort of delve environments. In this environment, the popcorn build, which is what I would have normally used for mapping, right, would have already died multiple times. It would not get this far casually, and this build casually does that, so that's nice. I think I have one more short run that I have the build go through, just to show you And again, I'm not very deep in the mine. You can see this is Delve 57, right? So this is not particularly spectacular content as far as Delve is concerned. But the build, as far as I'm concerned, is probably one of the better builds I've made for doing Delve content. What, I think... Oh, and now I think it was Cyclone. I think the only other build I've really liked doing Delve on was Cyclone. But Cyclone's, in many ways, Cyclone's actually harder to get started in this build. This build was other than a little bit of problems with the end of Act 4 and the low damage in Act 5, because I was, in trying to balance things, I hadn't really focused on getting damage into the build. Mainly flat damage to the build. That might have saved the passive tree motions a bit, and I had to sort on the passive tree more. I had to figure out more flat damage to make levels 4 and 5 better. And you can see I was basically spending no time trying to itemize, right? So had I spent more time to itemize, instead of just trying to zoom through the content, I probably would have had a lot more damage earlier, and that would have made it a lot more comfortable. But yeah, Iron Rings, I'll the Iron Rings early, and just basically you're rolling for flat fizz damage, which is always an available roll. It's just the Contempt Essence mod on Rings guarantees you get it. And this is going to be a pretty short video. I just did the 2 short stretches to show you it doing Delve. Because this is pretty much actually like half the levels between when I stopped Act 10 and getting level 80 was just casually going into Delve. Because in many ways this was actually funner than maps. Because if anything I was a little undergeared, so maps were sort of like, well, I know maps going to be better from a pure like juice mapping standpoint. I could probably run it better on the SRS build because it just has more damage. But this build was doing it perfectly fine. It was doing Delve a whole lot better than the SRS build would do. So here's maps. So I'm opening up Lighthouse. It's just a plain white Lighthouse, which is a tier 16 map. But I wanted to play something that shows how this handles maps, and also to some degree shows the Atlas I was running on it. Right, so I was really thinking, oh, this would be great in Delve. So I basically elevated a Delve Atlas. So we've got the full Atlas capacity on the Delve content set up and going here. And then I think I went pretty heavy on Scarabs, so I maybe haven't made use of the Scarabs as much as I should have otherwise. But this is a decent Atlas for Scarab farming. And honestly, I should probably take the essences off of it, or at least tone the essences down, because it's in a scenario where the essence monsters are spawning with too many essences. This build handles like 1, 2, 3 essence spawn monsters, but this is going to be the map where you're just going to see I walk up to an essence monster, just look at how many essences it has on it, like, yep, nope, no, that's not going to be fun to do. But yeah, so monster level isn't really a thing that's going to work this build. At this point, this build's at the point where it's specific mods, right? So if you get into an enemy that has block is sometimes pretty annoying, especially if it's block combined with something else, like energy shield regen, because the build has a low attack speed with a high damage per attack. So if like a third of your hits are going poof because of a block effect, then that's kind of well, that's a lot of your damage, right? Or at least feels like it's a lot of your damage. And Lighthouse is also a map with multiple bosses on it. And I think only one of the bosses actually gives me any real trouble on here. I don't remember if it's 2 or 3 bosses on this map. In practice, I think I basically see 2. That's how high the damage output is, that I think I basically delete one of the bosses without really trying. And if there's 3 bosses on there, then I literally deleted one of the bosses without trying, because I confused boss 2 and 3 if there's actually a third one here. I remember there being a third one, but on other runs with other characters, but maybe that's me misremembering what's on Lighthouse. But this is a map where you have a multi-boss spawn. It's a multi-boss from like a mercenary group. So the boss you get is sometimes random. So you can see here, what, I think that was a 7 essence monster, and I looked at it and I'm like, yep, that's not worth trying. Because the build wouldn't necessarily be threatened by it, right? So I wouldn't be in a problem of, oh dear, I break the map. It would be like, oh no, I've made the map just really uncomfortable. Because of the monster that just isn't going to die. That kind of happens anyway, because you can see, at this point, I think I may have already killed one of the unique bosses on this map. But you can see that guy right there is, for whatever reason, he's really, really tanky. And this is the white version of that, right? So this is our bully guy who's just tanky. There's the second one that I know of, right? So I may have killed the third one earlier, which is out nosing, but I think that guy may have a shield, which is why because he has a shield, I think he has some block, which has allowed him to survive a little bit more of the beating. But yeah, the Red Blade Warlord here is really the only guy who's tanky enough on this map, besides the Essence Monster, to be any real threat to the build. And that move specifically is the one that will end up killing me. Is you can see it went off there, and I went like, oh, it doesn't hurt. I didn't realize that Spell Block had eaten it, and as a side effect, it didn't take any damage. And then the second time it goes off, Spell Block doesn't catch it, so I get blown up. But that's the only time I die in this map, is I wasn't paying attention, didn't realize that was basically a slam. And that the build isn't taking enough to take that slam to the face. And I say isn't taking enough to take that slam to the face. It's probably tanky enough. If I had Steel Skin up when that went off, then I think the flat resist Steel Skin provides would actually allow me to tank it. But obviously in situ there, not realizing that it was going to do any damage, I hadn't prepped any of the defenses to absorb any of the damage that I could have done preemptively. Such as Enduring Cry or Steel Skin. In this case, I've just died to the boss, so what I'm doing is I'm making sure that everything else I can sort of casually clear off the map has been cleared before I go face the boss again. Because if it's just the boss is undefeatable, then I'd like to get all the loot off the map, if possible. Yeah, this is pretty much the recap, right? So the recap is that the build plays. There's no real problem playing the build. The build is level 80. I have no fear that the build would almost certainly go higher level than this. If for no other reason, you can see it's in just these 3 videos that I streamed together for B-roll. We went from almost the beginning of 80 to almost the end of 80. In just sort of random content. So a little bit more playing. I think it's already... may have already hit 81. I don't remember if I played it more, or if I'm just sitting right before level 80. Pretty sure I've hit 81 at this point, because of how close it was at the end of this video. And there's still more damage potential, right? So I've been saying I use Contempt instances to get that flat damage, or that, yeah, the flat damage mod. I wasn't using the most expensive Contempt instances, right? So there's actually, for all of them, there is at least 1 tier higher that I could get, which translates into like 2 more base damage. But because of all the big multipliers on there, 2 base damage is a few thousand damage. Right? So there's easily 6,000 more damage in this build. If you just sort of optimize it a bit more and have a budget, right? So in my case, I've gone through the casual contempts I've farmed. So this is basically an SRS build as it is. Like if you had multiple characters on an SRS server and you wanted to build a unique build like Facebreaker, without having to buy anything. That's basically where this build is. I spent more trading to fix things on the SRS build than I spent on this build, right? So this build is, granted, this build is, in many ways, is maybe quite expensive, because I think I raw spent divines, and it would have just been cheaper to actually spend the divines buying a, like, max Facebreaker than to try to reroll the Facebreaker. But I am adverse to trading, so I spent divines on trying to improve the Facebreaker. And I didn't improve it that much. If you remembered, it was around like 650 in Axe, and it's the same Facebreaker. I just threw 2 divines at it, right? So I spent 2 divines making the Facebreaker like 50% better, and I mean 50% more better, not actually 50% better, because it already starts at 650, right? So 650 to 700% or 700% more is not actually that much of an improvement, and probably wasn't worth 2 divines, but. Like, if I was spending currency in the trade markets properly with this build, as I can, because this is not, I'm not actually playing this in RSS, I'm playing this on the trade league. I'm just trade averse most of the time, right? So if I was actually spending money on this build, the build could probably be better. I'm not sure if I'm going to show you the entire fight. At this point, we've cleared all the map except for the essence monster and the boss monster here, right? And I have already completed Lighthouse, so you can imagine a scenario where it's like, well, I pulled the bad boss on Lighthouse. You're just going to GTFO because it's not worth the effort to kill him. I go through the effort to kill him because I'm stupid like that sometimes. But as you can see, like, the biggest problem with trying to take a boss down that's this tanky is I don't have the mana sustain. I literally run out of mana pots. And then I get into sort of a loop of I'm not really doing much damage because I don't have the mana sustain to do the damage. And the boss is just really tanky for whatever reason. I don't know why he's tanky. I suspect he's got a really high fizz resist. Because most of my damage is fizz. And again, I have no fizz pen on this build, right? Which is another way you could probably improve the damage of this build. One of the master is potentially looking at to annoy Tile was Crush on hit, which would have removed 25% fizz resist from every monster I hit. Which in hindsight, maybe if damage is the problem you're having from fizz resistant enemies, that's what you should do to fix that. But other than the occasional fight like this where the boss is just too tanky to defeat quickly, right? As long as I'm being careful here, I am at no risk of dying, right? It's just a really long fight because I don't have the damage I want for fighting him. But this is a tier 60 map, right? So the only way to get harder monsters from this is to alch the map or to do endgame boss content. And really, at this point, you should probably be alching maps, right? So I'd probably run this build on a slightly lower map tier on an alched map if I'm really trying to max loot. And honestly, depending upon what I rolled on the alch, you could probably run this map with the alch with this build. Because really, the only thing that was potentially a problem was the boss. And again, you can see the build hasn't been played long enough to even get all the gems at level 20. Which again, is something you can do to improve the build. If you're on Trade League and not trade averse like I am, you can frequently just go buy level 20 gems. They're usually not that expensive. But that requires negotiation, which I often don't do. Because I basically play solo self-found with trade turned on, just so that if I'm in a situation where I've accidentally bricked the build and I need to spend currency to fix the build by buying stuff from other people, I can. Right, so I basically play solo self-found without declaring it solo self-found. Which is, if I wanted to brag about that more, I should really just turn solo self-found on. But yeah, the build is handling this really well. And really, in the case of this tanky enemy, the only real problem is it doesn't quite have mana sustain for just doing that much damage. So you can get into a scenario where you run out of mana pots, and you'll just burn through your mana punching guys. And then the other one that isn't necessarily a scenario here is you can see his shield starts regenerating. If you get any scenario where like fast shield recharge is mixed with block or dodge, because sometimes you get those on rare monsters, and sometimes you get them together on rare monsters. Fast shield recharge if they can avoid taking damage from this build, because this build doesn't necessarily have a high attack speed. You can get in scenarios where they block a couple attacks in a row, and suddenly the build hasn't done enough damage to stop them from starting to regenerate the shield, and they get the whole shield back, and it's like, oh no. It makes some enemies tankier than need to be having the low attack speed. Though this low attack speed is really nice in some ways for fighting bosses, because most of the way the attack speed is generated in game is delay between your attacks and not necessarily delay in doing the attack. So you can do an attack, move, do an attack, move, do an attack, move, and it's got a nice rhythm to it, which is really nice for bosses like Azara. But when you get into scenarios with guys with energy shields, especially fast energy reshield recharge speed with something like dodge or block, where you aren't consistently doing damage, that combo can get a little annoying, because it blocks too many moves in a row, and all of a sudden you don't do any damage because it's regen dull its shield in a couple seconds. But yeah, the build works. The build is fun to play. I really like running it in Delve, because the AoE is really good for handling the masses of monsters. If I knew what I was actually looking for in Heist, I'd probably run it in Heist. I definitely don't have a Heist token problem. I've got tons of Heist tokens. But because again, the build's really tanky and has a really wide AoE damage. The only time when I get into problems is really high defensive monsters like this boss here, where it isn't even really a problem. This isn't a problem per se. It's just slow. And this is the reason why I actually skipped the Essence monster, because each Essence you put on a monster makes the monster that much tankier. And a 7 Essence monster is just going to be too tanky to be fun for you to watch or fun for me to deal with. And yeah, that's pretty much going to be this video. Unless I make some significant change or attempt an actual endgame boss, this will probably be the last video of the Facebreaker build, because there isn't much to show off other than the sort of boring I'm going through the grind that is maps with this build. So if I attempt an endgame boss like Azaria or something like that, I'll show that off. But for the moment, that's what I've got. If there's any other weird Facebreaker builds you want me to show off, feel free to let me know. But for the moment, or not Facebreaker, if there's any weird Path of Exile builds you want me to show off, feel free to let me know. If not, I'm going to swap over, at least for a little while, to a different game when I think of new builds. They're weird and wacky that are going to sort of be homemade builds like this one is. Probably I'm going to take a short break. Throat's feeling a bit raspy because I've been maybe trying to talk a little bit too much without breathing. Need to remember to actually do breathing. I'm going to swap over probably a little bit later. I've picked up Frostpunk 2, so this is the day Frostpunk 2 officially comes out for people that didn't buy the deluxe version. So at this point, there should be some Frostpunk videos up on the channel if you're watching on Twitch. If you're watching on YouTube, you almost certainly see these because I'm going to have this go up the day after the last of the Frostpunk 1 videos go up. But I'm going to go play Frostpunk 2 after a short break. So if you're watching this on Twitch, either there'll be a Frostpunk 2 video, or I'll be actively streaming at that point. And if you're watching this on YouTube, the Frostpunk 2 videos will be what comes up after this. And I suppose if there's any other games you want me to play, feel free to let me know. This is where Path of Exile ends for the moment. Wish you all a good night.